Hello, I'm Joshua Unruh, your superhero scholar. Welcome to Superhero University on Batman & Son. Session 2, Building a Better Batmobile. Have a seat. Class is now in session. Hello and welcome to this session of Superhero University. We have done the hard work of knowing Batman's history decade by decade, and now we finally get to dive into this first issue of the first story of so many stories that come together into one giant Batman story that is, for my money, the best Batman has ever been. So I hope you're ready, because here we go. First, to get started, something I didn't talk about much in the history of Batman, other than to just drop his name, is the writer of this series. His name is Grant Morrison. He is one of my personal favorites, and he has been writing comic books for a very long time. There are some titles you might be familiar with. He wrote The Invisibles, All-Star Superman. He wrote a run of JLA in the late 90s, early 2000s that is absolutely fantastic, and I've just about convinced myself I need to do a Superhero University on it. He did a series called Seven Soldiers that is 30 interconnected issues across 7 4-issue series with a bookend at each end that tells a story about a super team that never actually meets, but nevertheless manages to thwart a prophecy as old as humanity. So what you might be picking up is that Morrison's superhero stories tend to get big. But even when he's doing smaller, more personal things, they tend to still carry this amazing amount of emotional weight, even when it's not doing the spectacle. Invisibles is basically a book about wizards doing awesome things in 1980s London and then the rest of the world. We 3 is basically the incredible journey if those 3 pets were first a military experiment. It's pretty heady stuff, and I think you'll see that even in this first issue of Batman & Son. This story is drawn by Andy Kubert. He is a bit of a famous name in the industry. He's the son of a very famous comic book artist, Joe Kubert. There is actually a school of comic book illustration that bears Joe Kubert's name, and Andy and his brother both teach at it. Andy Kubert has done tons of superhero work for Marvel, DC, and other companies. Probably the most interesting thing to the listenership of this show is that he worked with Neil Gaiman on Marvel 1602, a weird little mini-series that told a tale of the Marvel Universe as though it had started in the 1600s instead of the sort of ever-present now that superhero comic books take place in. I could go on and on about Kubert's resume, but just know he's done a lot of work and he is a fantastic artist, and as far as I'm concerned, nails this arc. Not everyone can keep up with a Grant Morrison script, but Andy Kubert does it well, I think. Reiterating a few things we need to keep in mind as we go into this series. Every Batman story happened. Now, as we go forward, we might see some of them reframed or twisted a little bit, but remember that Grant Morrison is approaching this version of Batman as though every single Batman story that happened before this that's ever been published is part of this Batman's history. Just keep that in mind going forward. You also need to keep your eye on the Bruce Wayne-Batman dichotomy. I will have so much more to say about this as we go through this issue. Just keep your eye on that ball. I mentioned in the previous session that mind-altering drugs and hallucinogens would be a big deal. We literally open this story with it, and then do body-altering drugs by the end as well. Lastly, keep your eye on or&nbsp. You're going to see it a lot. It's very important, but not for quite a while. Just to keep in the back of your mind, remember that the first appearance of the Batman of or&nbsp is when our Batman went to a planet where he had the powers of Superman, or&nbsp, and he met the Batman from that planet and they had an adventure together, and it was pretty great. This is back in that weird science fiction 1950s when that kind of stuff was completely normal for Batman. It's not going to be quite like that in this series, but it is incredibly important, and it means a lot in this issue, even though it's going to be quite a while before it actually pays off in full. Now, it is my plan to go through this book more or less page by page, because there is that much going on in all of them. So we'll just start right here on page 1. This is the first, but not the last time that I'm going to say to you, slow down and look at the pictures. This is extremely cinematic and it's full of details. And take note, just like I said, we are literally starting with Commissioner Gordon, of all people, dosed by Joker venom, our first hallucinogenic drug. Turning to page 2 and 3, splash pages. Be honest. Who's a little concerned for Batman here? Shortly, we will find out that this is not, in fact, the Batman. But nobody knows what's going on when they first pick up this book, and Morrison has a reputation for doing crazy things. Who knows what is going on here? And for those of you that don't read superhero comics all the time or are a little less genre savvy, please reach out to me. Let me know. How did these 2 pages affect you? It's pretty serious, right? Now, within the context of this specific series, it sets a tone for this arc by beginning with Batman's most iconic villain, the Joker. Everything is going to be turned up to 11. Everything is going to be huge. This is the Joker. He has already beaten Batman, and he's doing it with a Joker copter in the background. Now, I mention the Joker copter specifically because this is a signal to those who have been reading for a long time that things are going to be different. The Joker copter is a holdover from previous times when slapping his face on stuff to do wacky gag-themed crimes was what the Joker did. So everything is going to be different, maybe even a little sillier. Morrison is taking the opportunity to reframe what a Batman story can be on the 2nd and 3rd pages of the first issue. Joker is holding a crowbar. Now, this is a very evocative weapon for him to be using. You'll remember in the previous session, I talked about A Death in the Family, a series that culminated in the murder by the Joker of the second Robin, Jason Todd. Before Joker blew him up with a bomb, Joker beat him nearly to death with a crowbar. It's incredibly evocative. The traumatized kids that Joker mentions also kind of calls back to A Death in the Family. Traumatized children are something of a short-term theme. We're not necessarily going to see it all through the entire opus, but it's a big deal right here in Batman and Son. And that includes the kids in the real world who were traumatized when Robin died. I admitted to you in the last session that I'm one of the kids who called the 900 number and voted for Jason Todd to die. I can also confess to you that when I finally got to read that issue, it was a punch in the gut. It really got my attention. I questioned my choices. Now, moving into page 4. Something Shakespearean happens here. The Joker is looking at us, the reader, when he talks about messing with heads and going on an acid trip. The bard famously used fools, like jesters, to speak to the audience of many of his plays. And we will see this again in just a couple pages. But if you didn't notice, most of the time in comic book panels, the characters do not look directly at the reader. It's like looking into the camera on a TV show. But the Joker is doing that very specifically here and is filling that place as the nearly omniscient fool doing narration directly to the audience. This is also where we get the biggest clue that this isn't the Batman we know. Despite whatever Zack Snyder or anyone else would have you believe, Batman does not use guns. Ever. And here's where I walk that back almost immediately. I'll admit to you, in his very earliest appearances, the first few Batman stories, he did carry a gun. Remember, he was a thinly veiled Shadow ripoff, and he carried a gun just like all those Mystery Men adventurers did. And these Mystery Men tended to leave their enemies dead and riddled with bullets behind them. This reinforces that idea that every story has happened. So while we've set aside the idea that Bruce Wayne would ever use a gun, the image of Batman using a gun is still evocative. It still supports that idea that every story matters. Now keep your eye on fake or replacement Batman, starting with this one. He will be a big deal, although not in Batman and Son. And the theme of replacement or fake Batman keeps coming up all through Morrison's run. It is actually supported by the text in a positive way when we get to Batman and Robin, and then it's turned on its head in a 100% positive way with Batman Incorporated. But we have got quite a while before we get to that point. Flipping the page, page 5. The real Batman is too late to save the Joker because he was busy saving the children. And it's a great image right there juxtaposing the authentic Batman with his lesser copy and showing exactly what it is that separates them. One of them saves, the other one kills. Going to page 6, I want to ask you all, what do you think the flaming card symbolizes? Now, I would say at the very least it represents destruction and rebirth, which is a favorite Grant Morrison theory for the Joker that we will talk more about in a future issue. But destruction and rebirth, pretty easy and obvious. What do you guys think? Is there more going on there? Take a look on this page and count how many instances you see of or&nbsp. Tell me how many you caught. Now, I'm going to point this out because this graffiti will keep showing up. These are totemic magic words, and they are going to keep showing up all through this series until they culminate and you won't be able to miss it. But one interesting thing is that introducing or&nbsp as graffiti calls back to Grant Morrison's earliest work. The earliest work that he got some mainstream attention for. In a book called The Invisibles, we are introduced right there on the first page to two young thugs, one of whom will become a main character, and they are graffiti painting the name King Mob, which, if you remember from the previous session, was Grant Morrison's self-insertion character, the biggest, baddest ass wizard of them all, that he used to represent himself in The Invisibles. Magical sigils, they matter to Morrison. They matter in the world of Batman, and they mattered in the world of Invisibles in a different way. This is a theme he uses through much of his work. You can now have an image of Batman cradling the Joker, and this calls to two different pieces of Batman literature. This goes back again to A Death in the Family and mirrors that image of Batman holding a broken and bloodied Robin. The other one that it mirrors is a bit of a spoiler warning. I don't know that I can declare the statute of limitations up on it, so skip ahead about 30 seconds if you don't want to hear. But for those of you who have played through the Arkham video games, this is very reminiscent of the end of Arkham City, only in that one, the Joker really was dead. He had died, and Batman was carrying his corpse out of Arkham City into Gotham City proper, which I think is why right here we get that cop saying, "No, wait, Batman, he's still alive." Those of us who are just all Batman all the time were like, oh my gosh, is this like the end of Arkham City? Is the Joker really dead? And this cop steps up to let us know, not the case. Page 7 is chock full of or&nbsp. I'm going to go panel by panel on this one. In the first panel, we have the leftovers of total chaos. Things have settled down or are in the process of settling down, but they're still chaotic. The cops are still protecting. The paramedics are still taking care of people. In the second panel, we revisit the traumatized children. In the third panel, we have a brutalized friend of the Batman. This is something that keeps happening to Batman's allies. We've seen it with Barbara Gordon when the Joker shot and paralyzed her and ended her career as Batgirl. We saw it with Jason Todd when he was beaten and blown up. And we saw it at the end of No Man's Land, where the Joker put everyone in an impossible decision that wound up with Sarah Essen, Commissioner Gordon's second wife, dead. Going into panel 4, this is very reminiscent of Nightfall with Batman in the backbreaker position. Remember, Nightfall is the story where Bane beat Batman and then broke his back. And there is a very famous panel of Bane holding him up over his head and then cracking Batman's back over his knee. In this case, we have Batman in the backbreaker position. And for just a minute, those of us who've been reading comic books for a long time might think about Dark Knight Returns. Dark Knight Returns is a story set in the future. It's after the end of Batman, and he's starting to come back out of retirement. And he is forced to face the Joker again and snaps the Joker's back and paralyzes him, saying, "I won't kill you, but I'm not going to let you brutalize people anymore." And the Joker, with the last of his strength, twists himself a little further and kills himself so everyone would think that Batman did it. So for just a minute, these images of Bane mix with these images of a much older story and make us all think he's about to break the Joker's back. But then, in panel 5, the Joker is thrown into the garbage where he belongs, and Gordon, still dosed on the Joker venom, laughs on. Turning to page 8 and 9. Not a splash page, but they're all of a piece, so I'm going to talk about them together. Gordon is still drugged, and frankly, is telling macabre jokes that are still actually funny, which for my money is a requirement for proper Joker jokes. They should be funny, and then you should feel bad about the fact that you laughed at them. This is our second example of a Shakespearean fool looking straight at the audience and making commentary. This time it's Gordon, not usually our fool character, but he's still dosed on the Joker venom and therefore is able to speak for the Joker. Now, I want all the writers listening to take note. There is some extremely clever exposition here. Technically speaking, this is 2 pages of people just talking, but it's framed as a wrap-up from the previous scene, makes a few legitimately funny jokes, stays interesting, and then sets up the next several things. The things that happen in the rest of this issue and the issues beyond are suggested in this conversation. And because the writer knows these characters and bounces them off of each other very well, and the situation is a little weird with Gordon still suffering from the Joker venom, so we get some inappropriate humor, the whole scene holds together as very funny and very interesting, and eventually we'll see very impactful on the story as a whole. And it ends with the question, what do you do now, Batman? That is a fantastic setup. And it's also a thing that we readers might be asking after all these previous pages. And for those of us who came to this when it was brand new on the stands, this upended years of Batman stories and what we had been led to believe that Batman stories were going to be. This upended all of them in just a handful of pages. And so Gordon's question might be our question as well. What do you do now, Batman? Turning to page 10, we can see that our first answer is, the Batman is bored. All that we see on this page is stuff that we know for a fact has to happen, at least in theory. We know that Bruce Wayne has to sleep. We know that he has to work out. We know that he has to eat. We know that he has to do upkeep on all of the Batman stuff. But it's very mundane. We know kind of in the back of our head that this is stuff that has to happen. But in the same way that you never see anybody on a sitcom go to the bathroom unless it's part of the joke, we never see this happen on the page. So if we are seeing these mundane things, that means so is Bruce Wayne. It could be boring for us as readers, but I don't find it that way because so much happens in the issue that this actually works to slow the tempo down for a minute. So much has happened in the previous 9 pages that a page where things stop happening really stands out. And this again goes back to show you how well put together the conversation scene is just before this. That doesn't feel like a tempo change. That just feels like a continuation of the narrative that we've been given. But this is slowing things down. It's giving us an opportunity to realize that if we're seeing this stuff, then so is Bruce. And this is usually the stuff he would also gloss over. Even so, there is still a ton of information passed quietly along to you on this page. Note that Bruce Wayne's sheets are all twisted up around him. His sleep is still tortured. Look that there is a ton of gym equipment, and most of it is extremely worn, especially the heavy bag. You can also see that this mirrors his body, which is also in fantastic shape, but extremely worn. You can see the visible scars. We note that there is a huge dining room for just one guy, which mirrors one of my favorite scenes in Batman 89, where Bruce Wayne and Vicky Vale are on a date and they are sitting at opposite ends of a banquet table in the Wayne Manor dining room. They are a football field apart when he quietly asks, "Could you pass the salt?" It's fantastic. And I'll talk a little more about how much I like the Bruce Wayne in Batman 89 here in a few pages. Just also take note of the fountain just outside the window. It will be very important near the end of this arc. And then lastly, we see meticulous, small, time-consuming circuitry work. Again, stuff that we know in some kind of cerebral way has to happen, but why are we looking at this? Going into page 11 and 12, we get an expansive look at the Batcave. Take note, the bats, the equipment, the extensive nature of all of it is suggestive and it's important. Note two things. In the foreground, the bat poles. In the background, a Batmobile under a tarp. Now, what we're to see on these two expansive pages looking at the Batcave, after we've just had one cramped small page looking at Wayne Manor, is that the Batman act is overshadowing the Bruce Wayne act. Deciding where the real man lies will be an ongoing meta theme throughout most of the opus. The point is made here both visually as we look at the Batcave and compare it to the previous page with Wayne Manor, but it's also right in the conversation between Bruce and Alfred as they talk about the changes in Bruce's voice that he no longer has to practice. I also believe that Morrison is commenting on the habit of many of the writers that came before him. For so long, Bruce Wayne had just been neglected. He barely showed up. It was all Batman all the time. And I think there's a commentary here about how that habit so utterly neglected Bruce Wayne that it left both identities essentially the same. Are there two identities anymore if we never see one of them? If it's just a vehicle for him to have a house above his crime-fighting basement? No, it's not enough. And that's why we're going to spend some time getting to know Bruce Wayne again. Page 13. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you the sensational character find of 1993, Tim Drake. This is the first of Batman's sons to show up on the page. To recap, Tim Drake is the third Robin. He is the kid who did not want to be Robin, but he took the mantle on anyway. He solved the mystery of Batman and Robin's secret identities, and after Jason Todd was killed and Batman became more vengeful and got hurt more and hurt others more, and Tim noticed watching the news. And so he went and introduced himself first to Dick Grayson and then eventually to Bruce. And he said, I don't want to be Robin because I see what happens to Robins, but Batman needs a Robin and I volunteer. He made himself indispensable and he is my favorite 99% of the time. You'll also note he's sliding down the bat poles. Now this is important because that's Batman 66 all over. Everybody who has seen even one episode of that show is familiar with the iconic bookcase sliding open and two bat poles marked Dick and Bruce that they slide down, and when we cut to the Batcave, it's changed their clothes. Again, Morrison is reminding us tried and true and frankly staid Batman readers that all the stories matter. All of them, even the silly ones. In Bruce and Tim's conversation, it struck me that while we know that Bruce won't kill, he is happy to trade on that dark reputation, and so he lets the story that he shot the Joker go ahead and spread. He won't do it. It's past his line, but he is not above letting other people believe whatever they want to believe about the Batman. We also see that Tim gets fed. I only mention this because it's going to keep on happening virtually every time the kid is on page. And we also see a moment where Tim asks about the new Batmobile, and Bruce says, don't look, it's not finished, and Tim honors Bruce's wishes. That'll be important in a later issue. Looking at page 14, Tim gets fed again, and then the bats get fed. But note, Bruce doesn't know that his butler feeds the bats. Robin knows. Alfred knows. Alfred does it. Tim is reminding Alfred to do it. But Bruce doesn't even know that everyone else takes care of the bats. He's the world's greatest detective. He notices things. Where's his focus? We hear Tim ratify Gordon and Alfred's suggestion that Bruce get out of town and makes himself available even though he is himself going on a little vacation. I think that's important because Tim is the most dutiful son. Dick is the oldest, but he's not around. We're going to get introduced to another son who is very much not the dutiful son. But Tim is the one that's there. Tim is the one that makes himself available. And I think that his bright, happy demeanor does rub off on Bruce Wayne. At a meta level, I make the argument all the time that Robin's introduction to the comic books is what made Batman fully Batman. He stopped being a vengeance-crazed loner and instead became a person who had to worry about the future and about his legacy. And he did that because he became a dad. But Batman can't be a regular dad, so he couldn't have a regular kid. It had to be that Batman and Robin relationship. But you can see that Bruce rubs off on Tim also, because Alfred has to remind Tim to take off his mask. Going into page 15, we see that Bruce is paranoid. But we also see that he recognizes it and decides that that is a reason to get out of town. I love this bit with Alfred where he jokes that he mistook a rather formidable nun for the Penguin. I like what it says about these two characters together. Bruce didn't overreact to possibly seeing Killer Croc, but he also realized that seeing a man in a green raincoat is maybe a sign that he should get out of town, and Alfred agrees with him while also poking fun at himself, because Alfred knows that you can't really poke fun at the Batman much. It just shows the closeness of their relationship. And I also really like dry, humorous Alfred. It reminds me so much of their relationship on Batman the Animated Series. And if you want to hear me go on about the dry Alfred wit and the relationship between Bruce and Alfred, his first surrogate father, you should listen to my Batman the Animated Series podcast, An Animated Discussion. The last thing that we hear from Bruce on this page before we see Tim roaring out of town is Bruce saying, "I'm very proud of him." He knows that. This is kind of a cool character moment to me. It speaks to me as a dad, honestly. Bruce is not a man who is good at sharing his feelings. Tim probably does know that Bruce is very proud of him, but Bruce doesn't say it. He doesn't say it very often. He doesn't say it as often as he ought to say it. And it's in this panel that he has a bit of a cat's in the cradle moment, I think, where he realizes how much he hopes Tim knows that Bruce is proud of Tim. At any rate, Bruce chooses to go to London, which is important for a larger theme. Batman is vital to Gotham City, but he is bigger than Gotham and has been so through much of his creation. He was a founding member of the Justice League. You remember from the previous session when I said that O'Neill and Adams' first big backlash against the Batman of the 66 television show was to turn him into a Dark Knight detective globe-trotting James Bond adventurer. You cannot have Gotham without Batman. You cannot have Batman without Gotham. But Batman cannot be contained by Gotham. He is a much bigger idea than that. And at the far end of this opus, we will see that global nature fully ratified in Batman Incorporated. On page 16, we get our first introduction to our villain. Now, she's kept shadowed so that we, the reader, can't know who she is yet. But there are hints for those of us in the know. But there are also smoke screens. It's very clever. One thing that we do see is that mothers and sons are going to be something of a competing mini-theme, in contrast to fathers and sons. Note how lovingly this woman hands the child a syringe of deadly virus as though it's a pudding pop treat. The woman who's been kidnapped is named Francine Langstrom. This is an important name. We know right away she is the wife of Kirk Langstrom, aka the Man-Bat, and Francine has also been the She-Bat. So, Kirk Langstrom is a man who invented a serum. It was supposed to cure his deafness. It was borrowing the genetic material of bats, who are well known for their hearing. It went out of control and turned him into basically a half-man, half-bat monster that Batman has faced repeatedly. Much to the surprise of everyone, Man-Bat was actually the first villain in the production order of Batman the Animated Series. The whole series debuted with Man-Bat as the villain in On Leather Wings. Turning to pages 17 and 18, just a few things I want to pull out. Bruce mentions the Earl of Wardenshire. That Earl is a superhero. He is the so-called Batman of England, the Knight. He has a sidekick, the Squire. The current Knight used to be the Squire to his father as the Knight, but has now grown up and taken over his father's mantle. Keep them in mind for when we eventually get to Batman and Robin. This is some more foreshadowing. Now, we will talk so much more about them later, but remember, Knight and Squire, and they are something of a mirror or a cracked mirror for Batman and Robin. And then Langstrom shows up. I have a question for you guys. What's with the Inverness cloak? Or maybe it's an Ulster coat? They're kind of interchangeable, but it's a weird thing for him to wear. I mean, is he just bad at blending into London? He thinks it's all Sherlock Holmes novels? I'm curious if you all see anything there that I'm missing. We close out these couple of pages with Bruce and Alfred detecting things. One of my favorite aspects of Batman as a character is that he is a detective. You get a lot of crime fighters, you get a lot of superheroes, you don't get that many detectives. And so I love it when we get to see Bruce Wayne detect things. And it's kind of great when the rest of his family gets in on the act also. I mean, of course, he trained all of his sons to also be great detectives, but Alfred's going to pick up stuff along the way. And then we wrap up that page of detecting things with Kirk Langstrom getting into the backseat of a car driven by two men in full ninja garb. That is a pretty great page turn, which is a thing those of you who don't read a lot of comic books should keep your eyes on. The best comic book writers always end every page with a reason to turn to the next one. Moving into page 19, we have a very dry Alfred having a conversation with a very dry Bruce Wayne about how Bruce needs to relearn to be himself. I love this moment between Bruce and Alfred also. Again, it just demonstrates how much relationship these two men have. And one thing to keep in mind is that among all of his many other skills, Alfred is an actor. He understands playing roles. He talks about posture, he talks about voice, he talks about costuming. Now, what do we make at this point of the Batman-Bruce Wayne dichotomy? Who do we, in this moment, think he really is? Who does he think he is? What do you all think? Let me know. Now, Alfred brings up the billionaire playboy routine, and I'm just going to come right out now and say it. I hate it. I hate this part of the Bruce Wayne character. I guess it made some sense way back in the day when that's what rich dudes were known for. And I guess they handled it pretty well through like Batman 66, where he was charming and playboyish in that he didn't actually have a job, but he was so chaste and respectful of women that he kind of got away with it. But in the year of our Lord 2018, this playboy nonsense has got to go. One of the reasons that Michael Keaton as Bruce Wayne in Batman 89 is one of my favorite versions of Bruce Wayne is that he creates a man who is compassionate and sensitive and also really, really idiosyncratic. Like, that guy is very weird, but he's very weird and off-putting in a way that doesn't make him creepy, while at the same time making it difficult to connect him with a master crime fighter. That is such a more interesting and less problematic take, but I'm going to remind you, for Morrison's purposes, all the Batman stories that ever happened, and he has had a lot of love interests over the years. We name quite a few right here on this page. Kathy Kane, Julie Madison, Vicky Vale, Silver St. Cloud. Now put a pin in Kathy Kane. She's going to be a very big deal down the road a bit. But Julie Madison was Bruce Wayne's fiancée when he first appeared in 1939 and 1940. Vicky Vale was made famous in Batman 89 by Kim Basinger. Silver St. Cloud is the love interest that was murdered in Wayne Manor to kick off the storylines Bruce Wayne Murderer and Bruce Wayne Fugitive that I mentioned in our previous session. Going into page 21, you're going to notice this pop art museum is amazing. And there is a ton going on. So for now, just take it in. We will look a lot more closely at it next issue when it becomes prop as well as setting. And it is, if anything, even more breathtaking then. Now, taking a look at the act of being Bruce Wayne. He mentions vacationing on the moon. It is worth pointing out that the Justice League's headquarters, the Watchtower, is on the moon. So he literally spends most weekends on the moon. He mentions visiting alternate universes as a joke to the ladies. But we know he goes to alternate universes all the time. This book comes not long after a story called Infinite Crisis that was a culmination of many multiverses fighting it out. We know that he is well familiar with a fifth dimensional imp in Batmite, and we also might be talking about Zur-En-Arrh. That story treated it like it was another planet, but there are different ways you could read it. I really enjoy how proud Bruce is of his performance, but that Alfred doesn't give him an inch. He's like, no, the growl's back. fix your posture, now I'm going to the car. It's worth pointing out that Alfred is going to the car to read Artemis Fowl. If you're not familiar, this is a series of books about a child criminal mastermind. I've read the first one with my son and we really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. Just keep the idea of child criminal mastermind in the back of your head because it is an excellent transition to the next page. Here we are, back to our villainous mother and child. Talia is revealed. The child is still shadowed. He's Bruce Wayne's son? I think it's a really great beat that Damian recognizes Bruce as his father from his posture and mannerisms, which is another example of Bruce not doing as great an act as he thinks he's been doing. And then finally, on the last page, Talia stands revealed. This child is still in shadow, but I can tell you what I was thinking when I got to this page. There was a story called Son of the Demon. They will make reference to Son of the Demon in the rest of Batman and Son, or at least a version of Son of the Demon. One of the interesting things that I think goes hand in hand with the use of hallucinogenics and mind-altering drugs in this story is that characters in the fiction tell the stories differently depending on their point of view. You are going to get a very different point of view on Son of the Demon from Talia than you do from Bruce. And to be honest, Talia's remembrance is much closer to the book I actually read. At the end of the day, the most important thing for you to know about Son of the Demon is that Talia and Bruce have a tryst, and at the end, Talia is giving her child away to an orphanage to protect it from both her father, Ra's al Ghul, and his father, the Batman. Now, I think it's really great here that we've spent some time building compassion into this timid, unsure kid, because it will not last. I don't want to say anything else, but just wait till you get all of this kid you can stand in the next few issues. Lastly, Ninja Man-Bats. We already knew that there were going to be Man-Bats, but the idea that they would be Ninja Man-Bats. Now, they're not doing anything. They're just hanging there. But they give us a very serious foreshadowing of the madness we can expect in the very next issue. Now, as you can probably hear in my voice, I love this series. I mean, I've gushed about how much I love this writer and this artist and the first part of this story that makes up this bigger story. It's probably not a surprise that I love it, but I'm hoping that you also loved it. My real hope is that you loved it even before I unpacked all of this stuff, but that I just deepened that appreciation as I talked about all these different things. Let me know. Send me a shout out on Twitter, send me an email, let me know how you're finding Batman and Son as of the first issue. To close out, let's take a look at what this issue did. It established all the most vital elements of Batman, and when necessary, turned him upside down a little bit. It established his big, colorful rogues gallery, specifically with the Joker, but then introduced a piece of the Joker's sillier, weirder past in the Joker Copter. It introduced Commissioner Gordon, but in a very compromised and dangerous situation instead of being the usual rock of solidity and safety that he is in these stories. It introduced Alfred, but an Alfred that is very worried about his surrogate son and about Bruce's ongoing difficulty with separating his two identities. It introduced Robin and showed his lightning effect on Batman's world, but also established him as a character unto himself with his own things going on. That'll become a big deal in a story called Batman and Son. It introduced Gotham, but also showed that Batman cannot be contained by Gotham. And at virtually every turn, we were reminded that every Batman story counts. And the suggestion is that all of that accumulated history and continuity and weirdness and crime and madness and supervillains and master criminals is going to culminate and roll forward into something big and amazing. And trust me, it does. And that brings us to the close of the second Batman session, Batman and Son, Building a Better Batmobile. If you have any kind of questions or input, you can find me on Twitter easily enough at Joshua Unruh. Please remember that Superhero University is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, check out patreon.com/pulpdictionproductions. So thank you again for joining me in this session of Superhero University on Batman, and please join me for the next one as we go into Batman and Son Part 2, Man Bats of London. Until then, we'll see you back here. Same bat time, same bat channel.